This video demonstrates using the if and switch statements combined with hash notation in a format table to create custom table output from system management objects. The sample script is fully commented, and the comments give full details on what fields we're looking at within which bytes, which are contained in which properties. But in brief, we use getWMI object to extract a WMI system management object of the class Win32 printer. This will return a collection of printer objects for all of our configured printers. We're going to pipe that to a format table command to produce a table output showing our printers. In the table, we want to have a printer name. There is a name property in the standard WMI printer object. We can just use it. We would like to know if the printer in the table is the system default. If it is, we want to indicate that clearly by putting the word default there. And if the printer is not the default, we want to leave it blank. The default setting in the printer object is a single bit contained within a byte stored in the attributes property. The attributes property is a bit field. In other words, each bit has a definition. The bit that indicates whether it's the default is the third least significant bit. If it's a 0, this is not the default. If it's a 1, this is the default. So we can use simple masking with a Boolean AND to test that bit by masking it with a value of decimal 4. When we use our hash notation that starts with the @ curly brace and goes all the way down to the closing curly brace, in our expression, we're going to be creating a property. So we need a name for it. We'll call it default, and that's the name that will show up in our output table. And we're going to use a script expression, a script block, to generate a value to put into our default custom property. That script is going to look at the current object being examined, the current printer object. It's going to pull out the property called attributes. It's going to use a Boolean AND test with a decimal 4, which will only come back as a 1 or true if that single bit was set in the attributes. So if it was, we're going to create a temporary variable called attributes as string. We're going to put the word default in it. If it's not, we'll set it to a blank, although this is a local variable, so it will be empty anyway. Once we've done our test and filled out our temporary variable, we can print our temporary variable as output for our expression. And that will cause this value, the thing we're printing out, to be stored in our custom default property. We do a similar thing for the shared attributes, although it's actually an 8 decimal. It's the next bit up, the 4th least significant. And in this case, we didn't bother setting the default empty because it's a local variable and it will be empty anyway. So this is using ifs nested inside an expression, creating a custom property for a format table. The other thing we have in here is a similar situation looking at another property called printer status contained within each object coming through the pipe. Printer status is not a bit field. Printer status is an enumerated integer value. So it can have the value from 1 through 7, and each value represents a different status of the printer. If it's decimal 1, the status is other. If it's decimal 2, the status is unknown. If it's a decimal 3, status is idle. Well, we don't want to print out these numbers in our status column in our output table, because that's very unfriendly to anybody reading it. They would have to memorize all the numbers. We don't want that. So we use a switch statement to test this property in each printer object coming through the pipeline. And based on the integer value, we create a temporary value in a variable with an English description. These descriptions came from the Microsoft TechNet website. I included a default to set something bad in there. Microsoft says it will only ever be 1 through 7. If you've been writing scripts or any kind of code with Microsoft for any length of time, you'll know that you should cover the situation when it doesn't come out the way Microsoft says it will. Once we have an English string for our status, we then print out that string just like before, which makes it the output of our custom property expression and stores it in our custom status property. So we're printing out 4 properties, 1 that comes from the original object, and 3, this one, and this one, which are derived from the data in the original object. And it's format table that's printing them, so we want to use -auto size, because otherwise, depending on your version of PowerShell, format table will mess up the display of the columns. Running it on my machine produces a table that shows I have a default printer, and I'm not sharing any of them, and they're all idle.